Today we're going to be talking about potassium. We're going to talk about what it does in the plant, how it's taken up by the plant, and how it interacts with other nutrients in the soil. So the three main functions we're going to be talking about today is first, water regulation, making sure your plants are able to take up water and hold their pressure. It's called turgidity or turgor pressure. The second is nitrate assimilation, making sure that as your plants are pulling in nitrate, that nitrate turns into a usable form in amino acids and proteins. And the third is sugar movement. As our plants produce sugars through photosynthesis, it's potassium's role to take those sugars and move them into the phloem so they can move up and down the plant exactly where they're needed. So first, with water regulation, we're going to be talking about osmosis. So the concept of osmosis is when water moves from an area with a lower concentration of ions to an area with higher concentration of ions. And potassium is generally going to be the ion that controls how water moves. So here we have a semi-permeable membrane, so water can pass through it. And water is always going to be pulled from this area of low ions to this area of high ions. The most important spot that this happens is in the leaves. The stomata are a bunch of little holes in the leaves that open and close dynamically to allow carbon dioxide to enter and water to exit. So water gets pulled up from the soil and then enters into the plant and then transpires, meaning it leaves through these stomata. And so if it's really hot and sunny, then we're going to be losing more water in the stomata regulation of the opening and closing those little holes in the leaves to prevent excess water loss. That's all driven by potassium's role in water regulation. Here we have a stoma. So this is where the carbon dioxide enters and water exits. And this opening and closing is determined by the amount of potassium ions that are in these guard cells that surround that opening in the leaf. When the plant needs the stomata to be open, it's going to pull in a bunch of these potassium ions. And remember earlier with the osmosis, when a bunch of potassium ions go into an area, it's going to pull a bunch of water in, and that's going to enlarge these guard cells to open up the stomata. And then when the plant needs those stomata to close, maybe it's getting too windy and too hot and the plant's losing too much water, it's going to pump all of those potassium ions outside of the guard cell, and those guard cells are going to lose their water pressure, so they're going to kind of deflate and close the stoma. And this is really important because that needs to happen dynamically. As soon as a environmental condition happens to the plant needs to respond instantly to open and close the stomata to make sure that there's always the exact correct amount of water in the plant and the plant isn't losing excess water. When we don't have enough potassium in our plant, then those stomata, they don't open and close at 100% efficiency, meaning sometimes they'll stay like kind of open and weak and our plants will lose a lot of water when they shouldn't. That translates to sometimes our soil could have an amount of moisture in it, but our plants are still wilting. That may be due to a potassium deficiency rather than strictly a water deficiency. This concept of osmosis and potassium ions being pulled into an area to pull more water in is the overall governing idea surrounding what potassium does in plants. We're going to go over a couple more examples of where that happens. So we might think that water is the key driver of making sure plants stay tall and upright instead of wilted, but it's water and potassium. So potassium is what draws the water up. If a plant has abundant potassium, it's going to be driving that osmotic pressure, meaning it's going to have an area of high concentration of those potassium ions to suck water and pull water to balance everything out. And what that does is it fills all of the cells with water so our plants stand upright. If we don't have enough potassium, what happens is we don't get that differential in pressure. We don't get that pulling of water into an area with a high concentration of ions, and we end up with a wilted plant if it has too low of potassium. So the water regulation and turgidity that potassium creates in a plant isn't just for the whole plant itself, it's also for every single cell within the plant. And when a cell is growing, it's expanding. And when we don't have an influx of water to push that cell outwards, kind of like a balloon, then our plants are going to end up with smaller cells, which translate to smaller leaves and less biomass and less overall growth. So potassium ions are being moved around to be pulling water to fill our cells like a balloon. And if we don't have enough potassium, then all of our cells are going to be deflated. They're not going to grow correctly, and they're not going to expand and get bigger. So when our plants undergo conditions like drought or heat stress, if they don't have adequate potassium, they're going to have an even harder time making sure that they don't immediately wilt and die. When we undergo conditions that are too hot or too windy, if we don't have that potassium, then our plants won't be able to pull in enough water and they'll wilt prematurely than a plant that has adequate levels of potassium. The second function of potassium we're going to talk about is nitrate assimilation. So plants take up nitrogen in the form of nitrate, but this nitrate ion can't really be used by the plant until it turns into an amino acid and then a protein. So potassium plays a key role in turning the nitrates that our plants uptake into the proteins. And that's what turns the nitrogen into actual biomass, making the plant able to use that nitrogen in the way that it wants to, which is turning it into new growth. And when we don't have enough potassium, we get an accumulation of what's called free nitrates. And when we have free nitrates in our leaves, they look really yummy to pests, and we get higher incidences of pest pressure if we aren't actively converting these nitrate ions into proteins, which I think is really interesting. If we don't have enough potassium, we just get this accumulation of nitrates in our leaves. And we can test that using methods like plant sap analysis and looking at our balance between potassium to nitrogen levels in tissue tests and plant sap analysis. So basically we can give our plants an abundance of nitrogen, but we want that nitrogen to be turned into actual biomass used by the plant to grow and get bigger. And if we don't have potassium, then the nitrate ions can't do that. They just stay as free nitrates, which increase a lot of stress to the plant and increase pest pressure and a host of other issues. And so we really want to be looking at our balance between potassium and nitrate in our plant. The third function we're going to talk about that potassium plays a major role for is sugar movement. So when our plants photosynthesize, they turn the sunlight into sugars, and those sugars are created in the leaves, the source organs, but those sugars need to be moved to the sink organs, which are our roots. So the sugars can be exuded as root exudates to feed our soil microbes, or moved to our fruits, the reproductive organs where we want sweeter fruits and overall better harvest quality. The way the sugars move from the leaves into the phloem, which is our transport method for moving those sugars around our plant, is driven through another one of these potassium ion gradients. And so what our potassium does is it moves a bunch of potassium ions into the phloem, which increases the pressure of the phloem and moves sugars into the phloem. And that's called phloem loading. So our leaves produce the sugars from sunlight, and those sugars need to move into the phloem and then down into our roots or into our fruits, our sink organs. Now, if we don't have enough potassium, then our sugars can accumulate in these leaves because we can't create this pressure difference in the phloem, and so then our sugars aren't going to move into the phloem to be moved to those sink organs. So these potassium ions are all over the plant and creating these pressure differentials to push different things where they need to go. And so in this example, it's those sugars. In the earlier example, it's bringing water into the cell to increase turgidity and a host of other areas where potassium is just kind of chilling as this K+ ion, but it's moved all around to bring water in where it's needed to expand things like a balloon and shrink them. All right, now we're going to be talking about how our plants take up potassium from the soil and how potassium moves around in the soil. Potassium moves primarily through diffusion from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So if we have a root system and these roots have sucked out all of the potassium at this root level, but we have a lot more of the potassium ions slightly lower, then we have an area of higher concentration and an area of lower concentration. And these potassium ions are all going to move upwards. But that happens fairly slowly, and it requires an abundance of soil moisture for these potassium ions to move, because these potassium ions, they move through the soil solution, which is water plus any kind of ions. So there's 3 stages of potassium availability. The most available stage is potassium that's in the soil solution. So these K ions are dissolved in water, and when we have adequate moisture, our plants can take up the water, and with that water, they pull in these potassium ions. The second, slightly less available, is the potassium that's loosely held on our cation exchange sites. So we have CEC potassium, we have a clay particle, and we have a potassium ion. And that clay particle is going to be negatively charged, and this potassium ion is going to be positively charged. And because potassium moves through the soil through diffusion, when we pull up all of the potassium that's in the soil solution, then these potassium ions stuck to the clay particles unbind and move into the soil solution. So it's kind of like checking account, savings account, and then a heavily liquid account with this fixed K. So fixed potassium means it's stuck in between the layers of clay, especially when our soil is more dried out. It doesn't move very easily, and it requires weathering and years to unlock that potassium as our soils become more weathered and break down. And so this fixed K is generally unavailable. The CECK is loosely available, and the soil solution potassium is immediately available. And so that's kind of what we want to be thinking about when we're looking at our soil tests. Maybe you're doing a Haney test with the exchangeable potassium. It's going to be these guys right here. And then with a stronger acid soil test, we're going to be looking at all of the potassium available, including some fixed potassium as well. Because potassium moves through diffusion, if we don't have adequate soil moisture, our potassium isn't going to be able to move at all, because it requires the movement from the high concentration into the low concentration. That movement from high to low happens with water. So if we don't have enough soil moisture, those potassium ions are not going to be moving at all. Making sure that we have adequate soil moisture is very important to making sure that our plants get enough potassium. All right, so to recap, potassium is primarily responsible for water regulation in the plants, and that's done through the stomata, which are the holes in our leaves that open and close to make sure that our plants have exactly the amount of water they need at all times. The second function of potassium is nitrate assimilation. So when our plants pull in nitrogen in the form of nitrate, that nitrate needs to be turned into proteins, which is turned into the biomass that nitrogen fuels for plant growth. And it can't do that if we don't have enough potassium. So looking at our balances between nitrogen and potassium in our plant and making sure that we don't have an abundance of free nitrates, which could go hand in hand with a potassium deficiency. The third function of potassium is sugar movement. The plant using these potassium ions to increase a pressure difference between the leaves and the phloem, so we can pull the sugars from the leaves into the phloem, so then those sugars can move where they need to move. Potassium moves through the soil through diffusion, meaning it moves from areas of high amounts of potassium to low amounts of potassium. And if we don't have enough soil moisture, that movement can't happen. Our plants take up potassium through the soil solution, through dissolved potassium ions, and those potassium ions enter into the solution from the loosely held binding sites on our cation exchange sites, on our clay particles. When we're looking at our potassium levels, we really want to make sure that we're looking at our soil tests, and we're looking at tools like plant sap analysis to make sure that the potassium that's in our soil is actually getting into our plant. And when we're looking at a plant sap analysis report, we can see things like free nitrate levels. And if we see high free nitrate levels and low potassium levels, we know that we need to increase our potassium levels so our nitrogen can be turned into biomass. I really hope you enjoyed this video on potassium. My name is Jack. I'm the founder and CEO of Cultra, a nutrient analytics software where you can take all of your nutrient tests you get back from the lab and upload them into our software. And you can see a bunch of insights like these potassium levels and the differences between your nitrogen and potassium levels in plant sap and a host of other features. I really hope to see you there, and I look forward to making another one of these videos for you.